Hi, and welcome to this presentation on audience and purpose. When we sit down to write or to communicate, there are elements that must shape our choices, things that we must think about before we begin our communicating. The first one of those things would be who we are as an author. So who are you? What's your personality? Those things will definitely play into what you write and how you write it. Number two is audience. We need to be aware of who we're writing to or who we're communicating with. And there are lots of things that we want to know about that group of people, and we'll talk about that in a second. We also want to figure out what's our purpose. What is it that we want? What's the goal of this communication? Do we want someone to do something for us? Do we want them to think a certain way? Do we want to entertain them? Do we want to teach them something? What's our goal? That's where purpose comes in. We'll also talk about that one in the coming slides. We also need to think about the context in which we're writing or the context in which we're speaking. And that kind of has to do, I think about politicians a lot when I think about context, because the political climate that they're in at the time that they're in office definitely determines what they say, how they say it, where they say it. Depending on who has power and who doesn't, it might make them, more bold to say what they want to say, or more meek if they need to kind of tiptoe around things. If their party isn't maybe in the majority, and so context makes a big difference. We want to be careful. The example in the book talks about wanting money from parents, and so even on a more ordinary level, the context about the relationship with the parents. Did you just get in trouble? It's going to probably be harder for you to get money from your parents, perhaps, than if maybe you just got a straight A report card. So the context, the things that are happening around that writing situation do play into what we say and how we say it. The last one is the text. So I need to think about and be consciously aware, what genre is going to work best? Am I going to write an email? Am I going to send a text? Am I going to write a letter? Am I going to write a story or a poem or an essay? How is it that it's best going to be communicated? I need to think about organization. In what order am I going to put things? That makes a difference. And then also the last one is the style of communication. Can I use slang? Does it have to be very formal? Those are the things that you need to think about in terms of communication. And all of this really is driven by who is your audience and what's your purpose. So if we think more in depth about audience, here's a question that I want you to just kind of think about for a second or two. I want you to brainstorm a list of things that you would want to know about your audience before you even begin writing about any topic. So what do you want to know about your audience before you even begin writing? And after thinking about it for a while, hopefully you came up with a couple of these things. You probably would want to know, what do they already know about the topic? Are they really knowledgeable? Are they not so knowledgeable? What is it that I'm going to have to tell them? And what is it that I can leave out? You probably want to know their background. So what opinions do they have? What educational background do they have? If it's a controversial piece, you might want to know what side they stand on, because those things will play a part. You might want to know age. You might want to know gender. You might want to know even how much money they make, because that all determines our opinions, our thoughts, and what we bring to a situation. And not that it's good or that it's bad, but those are things that we're going to want to know. So these are some of the questions that you might ask. So once you have determined the topic, so once you know what you're writing about and your purpose, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that's to entertain, persuade, or inform, you want to analyze your audience. Who's going to read this piece? How much do they already know about the topic? What are the audience's beliefs and attitudes towards the subject? If you're going into an audience that believes very much like you're going to have no problem at all. If you're going into an audience that believes the opposite of what you do, your job has gotten a little bit harder, and it's going to, that audience, and knowing that will kind of shape what you say and what order you write those things in and what examples you use, etc. You might also want to know gender, age, geographical location, education, professional positions, etc. And those things play in not because we're being stereotypical, but because it shapes our experiences and what we know. If you think about the topic of immigration, people in Iowa know immigration, but they don't know it in the same way as those people do who perhaps live in Texas or California. And so geographical location makes a difference. Education makes a difference. How long we've spent in school. Not that it's good or bad if you spent a long time or not very much time, but it does impact our thoughts. We then want to think about how can the information be organized. So once we know some of those pieces, then we can think about how are we going to organize things. We also can think about how we're going to catch the reader's attention or the audience's attention. If you've ever had the opportunity to teach or to be an instructor with a lot of little kids, you know that you need to catch and keep their attention right away. So if I'm going in and I'm a science person and I need to go and do a presentation to a group of second graders, I know that it needs to be high energy. I need to keep their attention, need to use lots of examples, probably need to be funny, jump around a little bit perhaps. But if I'm going into a college classroom, that's very different. So I don't have to keep their attention. I do have to keep their attention, but not quite in the same way. And in fact, if I go in with a ton of humor, that might be seen as maybe a negative in a college classroom, perhaps, because maybe I don't know what I'm doing. That's maybe the thought. And then lastly, if the style of the essay is going to be formal or informal, and this happens all the time. If you think about, if you're talking to your grandparents, you probably talk to them differently than you talk to your friends. And so one's a formal audience, one's a more informal audience. And so that shapes what we say and how we say it. So all in all, our audience is going to determine the following things. It's going to definitely determine our content. It's going to determine how we organize things. It's going to determine what genre we use, what examples we include, the points of emphasis, what kind of words we choose to use. Again, if I go back to that formal and informal, is it okay for me to use slang or to use words that are very informal and kind of colloquial, or do I have to be more professional about things? Also want to be careful with tone. If I go in thinking that I can be sarcastic and my sarcasm is lost, I go into a group of students and they don't catch my sarcasm, I could come off as very, very rude and turn that audience off. And so tone is that feeling that's created by our language. And again, it can be positive or negative. It could be sarcastic. It could be sad. It could be, reminiscent perhaps. And so audience will determine those things. Once we know who we're writing to, then we need to make those decisions. If we take a look at this slide, this gives us some examples. On the left side, you'll see a bunch of subjects, things that we might be writing about, topics. And on the right side, you see the audience. And if you look at any one of those examples, you couldn't prepare the same presentation for both audiences. If I were looking at a cooking class and then I were writing for or trying to communicate with expert cooks versus novice cooks, there is no way that I could have a presentation, the same presentation for both of those groups. The language would be different in the expert class. The novice would have to go a lot slower probably. I'd have to go into a lot more detail. The vocab would be different. My organization, I couldn't even do the same recipes. So my content would definitely change, as would my organization and my delivery. If I think about the next one, a teenager going on, telling about his weekend plans or her weekend plans. If I'm talking to my friends, very different conversation than if I'm talking to my parents. I might not tell my parents everything. I might shade the truth a little bit. My language is different if I'm talking to my parents versus my friends. I might drop a few choice words if I'm talking to my friends versus my parents. And so in that case, again, your content changes, your organization changes. And the same is true for the farming and Twitter topics as well. Those two groups of audiences cannot have the same presentation because they're so very different. When we look at purpose, purpose also determines what we say and how we say it. And so very similar to audience, we need to keep in mind our audience. Then we need to talk about, well, okay, so what is our purpose? What is our goal here? And if you notice, there's 4 purposes according to certain textbooks. Others will leave out the last one. But the first 3 are inform, persuade, and entertain. And then some will write in that one of the purposes is to describe. And our first paper's purpose is to describe, so I do include that one in there. Here's another example for you just to kind of think about. If you were going to inform someone about NICC, the college, very different from writing an entertaining but appropriate story. Also very different from convincing somebody to get into your program of study. So while NICC is your topic, your audience might be the same, but your purpose is very different. So an informative piece is very different from an entertaining piece, very different from a persuasive or a convincing piece. So different purposes, again, will affect, this is very important, your content, your style, your structure, and your organization. So very much like audience, purposes and audiences will affect content, style, structure, and organization. And you'll see that again on a quiz. So make sure that you pay particular attention to those 4 words. Along with what changes when we look at purpose, we also need to understand that we don't write just kind of in a with one purpose. We kind of carry these things out within a web of purposes, as Linda Fowler talks. We don't write, a movie summary just to persuade, because we're also informing at the same time. So as we're writing the summary, our purpose might be to inform, and as we're talking about it, the person we're talking to might say, hey, that sounds really good. I might go see that just because of what you told me. And so, we usually don't just write for one purpose only. Again, purpose is going to determine our organization, our content, our examples, what we emphasize, our word choice, and again, this tone piece comes up again. And so purpose and audience determine content, style, organization. All of those things are going to change. That's the end of this audience and purpose slide. There's a non-audio version if you want to go through and take some notes, and you can find that attached to this link. Thank you.